Well, on behalf of the Brewer Foundation and New York University, congratulations on making it to the semifinals. We are so happy to have you this afternoon for our 20th Annual International Public Policy Forum, semifinal number 2. My name is Andrea Sadberry. I'm the IPPF Executive Director. The IPPF is the first and only competition that gives high school students around the world the opportunity to engage in written and oral debates on issues of public policy. This year, more than 180 teams representing schools in 19 countries and 25 US states submitted qualifying round essays on the topic Resolved: The Benefits of Artificial Intelligence Outweigh the Harms. Judges determined the top 64 teams who entered into a written debate tournament, volleying essays back and forth via email. Judges helped us select the top 32 teams, and this process continued for several rounds until the Elite 8 teams were named. The quarterfinal debates took place last night and earlier this morning. At this time, we will begin the second semifinal debate with Slovak National Team from Slovakia competing against Potomac Oak from Rockville, Maryland. At this time, I'd like to invite our debaters to introduce themselves, beginning with the team that will be arguing in the affirmative, Potomac Oak.
Hi, I'm Kristen.
Hi, I'm Emily.
Hi, I'm Evelyn.
Now, at this time, we'd like to invite the negative team, Slovak National, to introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Nafisa, and I'm speaking first.
Hello, I am Teresa, and I will be delivering the second speech.
And I'm Martin, and today I'll be the third.
Welcome, guys, and congratulations. Well, now it's time to introduce the moderator and the judges. Serving as our moderator for this debate is Mr. David Baker. Mr. Baker was appointed in 1984 as coach of the St. Mark's debate team. He coached debating and taught public speaking for the 16 years prior to his appointment as the Director of Admissions and Financial Aid at St. Mark's. Under his direction, the St. Mark's debate program was named one of the 10 most successful programs of the 20th century and won the high school national championship in 1990. He's been involved in the IPPF since its formation 20 years ago. Our semifinal judges include Mr. Dave Houston, who has coached debate for over 30 years and has been a part of the IPPF competition since its second year. He has had 3 teams compete in the final round of the IPPF. Mr. Houston serves on the IPPF topic committee and has judged the IPPF written and oral competitions for years. In addition to his IPPF activities, Mr. Houston has served 3 terms on the National Speech and Debate Association Board of Directors. He has been a district chair for the NSDA in Iowa and Texas. He is highly skilled at tabulating debate tournaments, serving as the tabulation director for the Glen Brooks Tournament, the Tournament of Champions, Green Hill, and the Texas Forensics Association State Tournament. His debate teams have won numerous state, regional, and national competitions. Mr. Houston is an Emory University Barclay Forum Key Coach, a member of the Texas Forensic Association Hall of Fame, and the NSDA Hall of Fame. Mr. Mia Andrick is an international communications, speech, and debate teacher, philosopher, and sociologist. Among other things, he is currently director of the National Debate Organization Slovenia, on the board of directors of the International Debate Education Association, and president of the Society for Development of Humanities. Mr. Andrick has served as program director of several international debate academies in the Middle East, Africa, the US, and Europe, and has been a National World Schools Teams head coach since 2013. He's been chief adjudicator or expert coordinator of more than 50 international competitions and has been guest lecturer or trainer in more than 50 countries. He is the convener of the International Philosophy Olympiad and is currently working on several international research projects and books connected with development of modern debate-related pedagogical approaches and teaching materials. Mr. Alex Puy is the current Vice President Finance of Europe for the world's largest brewer, Anheuser-Busch InBev, and is based out of Brussels, Belgium. He was an award-winning high school debater at the Alexander W. Dreyfus Jr. School of the Arts in Florida. With his help, his school won the IPPF in 2006 and 2007. He now heads the IPPF Circle of Champions, our alumni organization, and is a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. With that, we will turn things over to Mr. David Baker.
Thank you, Andrea, very much, and congratulations to everyone for reaching the semifinals. Would like to remind our judges and teams to remain muted unless you're speaking or preparing to speak, and of course, during cross-examination periods, we'll ask all members of the teams and the judges to unmute their microphones. Would ask the captains to please monitor. I don't want to interfere any more than absolutely necessary. If you'll monitor to make sure, like, for example, in the team cross-examinations, like for everybody to ask a question and everyone to answer one. So I don't have to keep interrupting. If you'll monitor that and make sure that that happens, captains on both teams, I would very much appreciate that. You've all received a copy of the oral argument format, so there won't be time signals from me. I assume everyone there has the ability to keep time, so there won't be any signals from me except when we get to the end of your speech, and then you'll hear the alarm go off on this end. So without further ado, we'll start the debate with the presentation, the opening presentations by the affirmative and negative teams. We'll start with the affirmative for a period of 8 minutes. You may begin.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Awesome. Time starts now. Today, we face more threats to our existence than any previous era of human history. Advancing medical innovation and finding solutions for pandemics and climate change is the greatest challenge of our time and requires an equally great technological revolution. In this debate, we affirm the capacity of AI to reshape healthcare and the environment. First, an overview. International coalitions are successfully implementing AI regulation. 42 countries have agreed to intergovernmental standards for AI policies. These measures prevent abuses by designing AI systems to respect human laws and implementing safeguards such as human override. Individual nations are also trending towards stringent regulation, as all governments have incentives to regulate. Even irrational actors care enough about themselves to prevent crises at the hands of unregulated AI. A holistic analysis conducted by DC research firm Cognilytica finds that every single country has already implemented successful regulations, from Japan to Mexico to Britain. History proves that regulation is feasible. As the Industrial Revolution transformed Western civilization, legislators adopted policies to combat adverse effects resulting from new technologies. And as powerful AI continues to revolutionize the world will continue to respond with equally powerful policies. Contention 1 is the healthcare revolution. The World Bank reports that half the world's population cannot access essential health services. Cost is a major hurdle. 100 million people are pushed into extreme poverty each year because of health expenses. AI will reform our current system, galvanize innovation, and expand accessibility to the world's medically underserved population. Global investment into medical AI will reach $6.6 billion this year, as experts anticipate that 75% of healthcare organizations have invested into it already. Subpoint A is bridging the gap. Medical technology companies have unveiled AI that can remotely monitor patients' vital signs for early detection of heart and lung conditions. Not only does this expand affordable medical care to the globally underserved, as algorithms are accessible from anywhere and do not need human physicians' expensive time, but they also boast 99% accuracy. This is in contrast with only 70% from human practitioners. AI-driven telemedicine is life-saving for populations lacking physical health infrastructure, such as areas in low-income countries. Dr. Eric Widman of the University of Notre Dame reports that Google's Seeing Potential machine learning algorithm is already preventing blindness in diabetic patients in rural India, where it is impossible to manually screen all 70 million diabetics. Furthermore, the vast troves of data that AI is able to collect allows emerging governments to analyze patients' sickness and geolocation needs, which helps to better allocate healthcare infrastructure, implement effective sanitation measures, and pinpoint environmental factors with patterns of causing illnesses such as cancer. Subpoint B is drug development. Humanity is discovering drugs at a declining pace. Worse, it costs as much as $2.6 billion to develop a treatment, since 90% of drug candidates fail under traditional systems. Increasing the rate of drug discovery is essential for several reasons. Number one, overuse of existing antibiotics has led to drug resistance through super-resistant bacteria that will kill 10 million annually by 2050. Number two, an aging population and changes in societal behaviors increase chronic conditions by 57%, which 1 in 3 suffer from. And number three, infectious disease outbreaks have been increasing in number and novelty and kill more than 17 million annually. Crucially, AI promotes effective drug discovery by identifying more promising drug candidates and speeding up the process. AI screens 20 million genetic compounds daily, producing results 100 times faster. For example, AI identified new antibiotic molecules that work against previously untreatable bacteria strains, simulated millions of potential medicines to find an Ebola treatment, which saved costly physical tests and human lives, and further drug development for various cancers and conditions like ALS. It then comes as no surprise that almost all major biopharmaceutical players are implementing AI in the status quo. Subpoint C is pandemics. Pandemics are becoming more frequent and severe, with experts estimating that we will face a pandemic once every 5 years due to globalization, urbanization, and factory farms. Luckily, AI will play an increasing role in combating future pandemics. AI can diagnose pandemic patients faster, find treatments more effectively, provide remote healthcare access to the most vulnerable, and increase the capability of hospitals. For instance, one hospital saw a 60% improvement in its ability to admit patients because of AI. AI can also predict the spread of diseases before it even happens, such as by identifying COVID-19 hotspots 10 days in advance. Critically, the coronavirus pandemic has killed over 1 million people so far, and without sufficient safeguards, future pandemics will pose existential risks. Contention 2 is environmental sustainability. Climate change is the greatest challenge facing our species. It already causes 400,000 deaths annually, and this number will skyrocket to over 153 million for every 0.5 degrees Celsius increase. Subpoint A is clean power. With the capacity to predict, model, and adapt faster and better than humans ever could, AI has the ability to unlock the vast potential of renewables. For example, it can find the best sites for hydropower dams to produce the lowest emissions, allowing for more extensive use of hydroelectricity. AI applications also hold massive potential at power grids. The inconsistency of renewable sources makes it challenging to ensure a constant energy flow, but with algorithms that can forecast energy production, analyze large swaths of data, and make predictions, AI can support the active management of electricity grids by improving the accessibility of renewable sources. Already, AI has created an flexible and autonomous electricity grid in Norway, allowing it to easily integrate renewable energy. Thus, experts conclude that AI can reduce global CO2 emissions by 20%. Subpoint B is agriculture. As climate change brings about more extreme weather, agricultural production will inevitably be affected, jeopardizing not only the global food supply, but also the livelihoods of 2 billion people. Fortunately, AI will revolutionize agriculture to ensure our success. AI can constantly monitor crops to alert farmers of diseases and abnormalities while offering critical information on the crop's overall needs. Hyperlocal weather forecasting also aids farmers' decision-making. For example, AI precision agriculture that provided information on preparing the land, applying fertilizer, and choosing sowing dates helped farmers in India reap 30% more produce per hectare. Moreover, in places especially affected by climate disasters, AI models can predict crop yields months before harvest, allowing us to pinpoint low-yield areas, prevent food and resource waste, and plan the management of food supply ahead of time. Subpoint C is water security. By 2030, the global population will face a 40% shortfall in the water supply as pollution and climate change alter the water cycle. AI can prevent this growing water crisis. For example, Stanford researchers combined remote sensing data with AI to detect small reservoirs, which can help deliver drinking water. As water becomes more scarce, regional wars for water resources will become even more frequent. To respond to this growing threat, scientists developed an AI that uses data to flag areas where water conflicts are prone to developing. With that data, researchers can investigate the causes of water conflicts and direct help towards those areas. This AI was proven to predict over 75% of all water-related conflicts in the Inner Niger Delta a year in advance, allowing us to prevent these water conflicts in the future. Yesterday, we saw technological innovations that exemplified the human capacity to push boundaries, break ceilings, and continuously reshape our world for the better. Tomorrow, we face larger challenges and louder adversaries. Our greatest existential threats, pandemics and climate change, can only be countered by AI. For these reasons, Potomac Oak is more than proud to affirm.
We'll have the opening statement from the negative team for a period of 8 minutes. You may begin when ready.
The world is not a fairy tale where good always triumphs over evil. Unlike affirmative, we recognize that AI is a tool and its potential is bound to be misused by malicious actors. Hence, we urge our judges to consider the incentives of various actors involved and evaluate this debate based on whether their usage of AI is likely to result in a net benefit for society. In my speech, I'll rebuttal the core of affirmative substantive. I'll introduce the first constructive argument about AI's effects on the global workforce, and the second about the rise of digital authoritarianism. So first, healthcare. According to Dr. Drew Smith, recently discovered drugs share two characteristics. First, they impact only less than 0.0025% of the population. And secondly, because of this, they're extremely expensive, as their median price is $83,000 per patient per year, meaning that they're affordable only to a fraction of these people. The reason is when they're developing drug, the core thing that we're doing is combining proteins. However, we have already found most of the efficient recommendations, and therefore drugs for diseases such as Alzheimer's Alzheimer's or diabetes haven't been discovered, although the AI has been implemented. Moving on to climate change. While the affirmative wants to take baby steps towards combating climate change, AI takes mankind 2 steps backward by promoting consumerism. So, as Alima explains, by constant retargeting and psychological tricks by AI algorithms, customers purchase products they otherwise would not even consider buying. Impacts of that is that, according to Mass, AI causes users to make 40% more clicks and 50% more purchases compared to non-intelligent advertising. And this is important because, as eco-resolution state, 99% of the products people buy are trashed in 6 months, creating 2 billion tons of waste each year. Because of AI, the number is expected to increase by 70%. Notice that also all of the points brought by the affirmative regarding AI, measuring emissions or predicting pandemics, do not have a significant impact, since the biggest issue with these challenges are not prediction or measurement, but enforcement and implementation, which is consistent on governments, which actually directly clashes with our second argument. I'm going to move on to our first constructive is AI's effects on the global workforce. While our opponents celebrate artificial intelligence capacities, they clearly misunderstand its socioeconomic implications. First, AI increases unemployment. It allows further automation at an unprecedented pace and scope, since it enables the process by utilizing previously human exclusive functions such as image recognition, data process, and so on. These both automate jobs in novel ways. AI decreases demand for new workers as technology improves itself without human input. So this is explicitly visible in ability of AI to recognize speech or engage in conversations, which has been utilized by Google's call centers to replace humans, as concluded by MIT. This is magnified much further in countries where the economy is based on manual labor, and their factories are largely reliant on exporting goods to the developed world. And COVID-19 and Suez Canal situation prove that supply chains are extremely fragile, making companies reconsider their presence in developing world, resulting into shifting from cheap manual labor outside of the country to increasingly more affordable automation-based factories in their countries. And these impacts are devastating on the majority of the developing world population that are dependent on this income. Second, income inequality. I'm going to first talk about lower class, then I will move on to middle class. While the affirmative might argue that AI creates new jobs, which could provide opportunities to the laid-off workers, as MIT notes, such jobs require high-skilled labor. At the same time, as Brookings finds, occupations that require less than a bachelor's degree have an average automation potential of 55%. As most high-skilled jobs require higher education, a simple requalification program will likely not suffice regardless of its efficiency. However, according to the Workforce Investment Standard Evaluation, government's reskilling programs are also highly ineffective, since the programs fail at raising participants' earnings and are offering services that don't meet the needs of job seekers or employers. Even if these programs were effective, they would still have low success rates of getting employment in the respective fields, because of the fact that while workers are being displaced by automation, new tasks are coming at a slower rate and primarily employ high-skilled workers. According to research from Oxford, in general, the increase in educational requirements will exceed the capacities of an average worker, and people from lower class often cannot afford to live without an income. Once these jobs are removed, they will struggle to adapt, thereby spiraling into a vicious cycle of poverty. However, while automation harms the poorest, intelligent automation harms the middle class on top of that. According to Gosh, the effects of AI automation are drastically different from previous revolutions. Since whereas those earlier revolutions complemented human muscle, the new ones will replace human cognition. Consequently, jobs like office supports will likely be automated by AI, according to McKinsey, because these jobs are highly repetitive and high paying. As Reinhardt writes, workers are entering a dichotomous workforce, which is effectively a dead end with little opportunities to progress. Conclusively, this diminishes the significance of affirmative's impacts. Even if the affirmative power could be used for good, an average worker will not reap its benefits. Ultimately, a technology that benefits the fortunate few at the expense of the unfortunate many is inherently harmful. Moving on to my second constructive, the rise of digital authoritarianism. Affirmative side has claimed that countries will adopt regulations that will control AI. However, we could never ensure that authoritarian regimes such as China or Russia will comply. In fact, we would like the judges to know that all present-day international regulations are non-binding, and do not sanction countries for breaching them. In fact, AI's potential has already fallen into the wrong hands and strengthening authoritarianism in every regard. Firstly, by silencing dissent. Secondly, by intensifying oppression. So first, AI makes authoritarian governance irreversible. Without AI, descendants could hide and thus escape prosecution. However, as stated by Polakova, in places such as Hong Kong, dictators and semi-authoritarian leaders abuse AI online activity trackers and facial recognition technologies to monitor their citizens, which deters disobedience. Moreover, by detecting suspicious behavior and preventing dissenters from communicating, AI destroys the main ingredient of successful resistance. According to Parkinson, in Uganda and Zambia, Huawei's AI helped governments spy on their opponents, intercept their encrypted communication, and then further localize government critics and arrest them soon thereafter. Second, AI proliferates human rights abuses against minorities the regime targets. According to Bunin and Kirby, Chinese security services utilize AI to monitor and prosecute members of the Uyghur minority. More than 1 million Uyghurs have been forced into detention centers, facing violence, torture, and enslavement. AI is key in capturing Uyghurs. As Anderson explains, AI algorithms hunt for ideological biases day and night. They're used to scan chat logs for Quran verses in order to prove that a particular Uyghur is not assimilated into the dominant Chinese culture. Notice, panel, that after AI's implementation, the number of annual prosecutions in China increased from 30,000 to 350,000, as Milward and Peterson note. This is important because according to Human Rights Foundation research, 3.9 billion people live under authoritarian governance. Freedom House finds in 2020, 75% of the world's population lived in a country that faced deterioration in democracy, and the proportion of not free countries is now the highest it has been in 15 years. But even more concerningly, according to the Japan Times, China is avidly exporting AI surveillance software to more than 60 countries currently, and it's increasing the scope of influence of authoritarianism that we have seen because it has such a huge influence on the African countries and so on. So therefore, all of these countries are either democratically flawed or highly susceptible to authoritarian tendencies. Conclusively, AI silences the outcry for democracy and gradually leads many hybrid political regimes down the path of digital authoritarianism. And these are precisely the countries that affirmative cannot control by their non-binding regulations that, as they have claimed, most of the world have implemented. So if we look at the entire picture of this debate, while AI might benefit the lucky few, those impacts come at the expenses of billions. AI turns hybrid regimes authoritarian, aggravates oppression with human rights violations. Additionally, AI robs millions of workers of their jobs with nowhere else to go. Conclusively, both the scope and intensity of harms incurred by AI far exceed its potential for good.
Thank you very much. That concludes the opening statements. We'll now have a 3-minute break to prepare for second speeches, the first of which will be presented by the affirmative. 3 minutes until second speeches, 3 minutes. One minute. Sorry, I was muted. That's time. We'll start with second speeches, beginning with the affirmative for 5 minutes. You may begin.
Okay. Can everyone hear me fine? Okay. So I'm going to start with responding to the responses they just made, and then I'll go to their case. First, they say that new drugs are barely innovative and they're not accessible. We agree that right now drugs are not innovative, which is precisely why AI needs to be there to pioneer innovation, make new discoveries, and identify new antibiotic molecules so we can revitalize innovation. We agree the status quo isn't looking good, but then they talk about inaccessibility. We say that you need to have the innovation and the breakthroughs in the first place in order for people to have a chance of access at all. Then on environment, first they talk about consumerism. We would say this is a very tiny impact at best. The bulk of pollution and global warming comes not from individual consumers, but rather large corporations and countries in general. This is a tiny impact at best. It's offset by the benefits of AI on climate change. Also on enforcement and implementation, first we say there's increasing pressure to take climate action, both on governments and on private companies. But second, again, we would say governments are not the only actors that implement climate AI. A lot of private large corporations also have profit incentives to do so. Let's move on to their case. First, in the workforce, AI with its massive data processing and analytical power would allow firms to drive cost efficiencies and improve their products. And as costs are cut and productivity increases, by 2030, AI would contribute up to 16 trillion to the global economy and on net create 58 million jobs. Rising productivity is key because it enables firms to lower prices and increase wages. Our opponents argue that AI only creates high-skilled jobs, but AI-driven increases in productivity allow countries with even the highest proportion of lower skilled workers to see increased employment. For example, AI algorithms in Africa will create 3 million jobs in just 5 years by increasing efficiency and demand. Second, AI improves education and therefore stimulates economic growth because it introduces individualized training and personal assessment to students. For example, in one school district alone, AI boosted graduation rates by an astounding 27%, and increasing graduations by just 7% would bring enough workers into the workforce that it would increase our GDP by $5.7 billion. My opponents even concede the importance of education because it addresses the root causes of economic disparity, especially in today's information-driven economy. Also, it's important to note that automation is not always the same as AI, because a lot of the kind of automation that replaces manual labor is machines that utilize repetitive tasks like in factories or assembly lines. It's not artificial intelligence, so it's non-topical, it's non-unique. On the other hand, we argue that AI actually uniquely creates jobs and makes existing jobs also more effective by providing new tools. Let's move on to surveillance. First, on the idea of regulations, I will respond to it throughout, but we would argue that the overview we read at the beginning of our case says these regulations are actually binding. But with that, let's move on to the specific argument. You can first cross-apply the arguments I read about education because it's a liberalizing force against authoritarian regimes. The more educated people are, the better equipped they are to actually speak up against oppressive governments. But second, regulation actually prevents surveillance. For example, Brazil, 28 European countries and numerous US states have already enacted restrictive surveillance laws. The continued development and rising support for these policies drastically increase the likelihood of their eventual implementation globally as it raises pressure. This suggests that AI surveillance is always a short-term problem. It's inevitably combated with international coalition. Moreover, democratic institutions have a vested interest in preventing the proliferation of authoritarian regimes. Countries like the United States have historically interfered whenever they felt like liberal democracy was threatened. Take Cuba, Vietnam, Korea, right? There's so many examples. There's no reason why China is just going to be allowed to export authoritarianism all over the world. Specifically in the case of Uyghur surveillance, it's clear that the Chinese government, which has been engaging in oppression against the citizens for decades, would have pursued similar actions even without the existence of AI. They'd simply choose another avenue to oppress their people, such as their blanket non-AI mass surveillance and mass crackdowns on whole populations. AI simply allows already corrupt governments a slightly more efficient method for encroachment, and at that point, the harms of surveillance are way too marginal to outweigh the benefits presented by the affirmative. Also, we would say that AI actually benefits democracy in many ways. For example, it can do crowd counting. It was utilized in the Hong Kong protests. This is really important because turnout is used to measure the strength of pro-democracy movements. And Joseph M. Chang, a journalism professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, says that from the angle of a social movement, numbers represent power. But furthermore, AI can also be used to cover faces of people at protests, for example, during the Black Lives Matter protests. It can also be used to pinpoint footage of things like police violence against peaceful protesters and other relevant footage. And let's also talk about the root cause of surveillance, which is authoritarianism. First, on the idea of it being spread, first you need to note that AI is only a tool for already autocratic regimes. Empirically, there isn't a single country that wasn't already authoritarian that accepted China's technology. So this increase in authoritarianism is actually already there in the first place. And furthermore, China doesn't need AI to spread authoritarianism. For example, it's arguably much more successful in spreading propaganda through the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which promotes opaque infrastructure deals and loans, propaganda, and party-to-party exchanges that actually give it more leverage. Our arguments about pandemics and climate change serve as a prerequisite because they actually destabilize countries and give governments more an opening to become more authoritarianism and tighten control over their people.
Thank you. We'll have another break for 3 minutes.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Am I audible now?
We'll now have second speeches. If we could keep everybody on each team. If you're all in the same room, we'd like to keep you all on camera if we can.
Oh, okay, sure. Just come here, guys.
Also, you're second to the first. Because you're not speaking now.
Okay. 5 minutes. Start when you're ready.
Whatever, let's all go there. It doesn't matter.
Could you please shut up? Okay.
What first? Like,
Overconsumption, polarization, inequality, oppression. Honorable judges, AI is a false promise that exacerbates the demons of our society. 4 areas of clash in this debate. First, healthcare. Second, climate change. Third, the economy. Fourth, authoritarianism. Let me begin with healthcare. First of all, with regards to pandemics, AI proliferates pandemics by diminishing trust in public institutions. As Hoffman explains, what matters the most is what we do while waiting for the vaccine. Adherence to restrictive measures is key. However, as Beth notes, AI algorithms encage people in social media bubbles, polarize society, and make political authorities appear illegitimate in the eyes of the masses, which decreases obedience. Startup finds that 80% of Slovak break COVID restrictions. Absent AI, the problem would never escalate to such an extent. Ultimately, prevention would save millions of lives, which is comparatively better than spending years waiting for a remedy. But second of all, in terms of accessibility, according to the UN, we have a cure against malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, yet 1.6 million Africans die annually because of them. The problem is unequitable distribution, and clearly the incentives are not pointing to the right direction, and we have no reason to believe that AI will magically change that. Moving on to the second area of clash concerning climate change. Firstly, in terms of renewables, AI is doing the exact opposite. According to Exxon, big techs will sell AI to oil companies to expedite oil discovery, extraction, and distribution, growing the fossil fuel industry by 200 billion annually, thus disincentivizing key actors to switch to renewables. But second of all, they completely dismissed our argument about consumerism. But yeah, even though it's a large corporation who are producing the goods, it's precisely consumers who are bound to buy them because of the manipulation. And because of that, ultimately AI adds fuel to the fire of our planet. They lose this clash. The second part of this was food security. So in terms of accessibility, according to the UN, most small farmers in the global south have poor access to technology. In Kenya, for instance, only 5% of small farms have access to electricity, while only 0.1% has access to telephone. But second of all, even if that was the case, farmers will lose their jobs because according to the World Bank, 65% of the working poor are farmers. And Oxford research concludes that AI will block traditional growth path by replacing low-wage jobs with robots, which will diminish their living standards and strip them of employment. Therefore, they clearly exacerbate the climate crisis and harm the most vulnerable. Moving on to the third area of clash concerning the economy, let me first begin with a short rebuttal to their education example, because affirmative greatly overestimates the difference AI makes. Affirmative talks about the Microsoft paper about that one particular school district where the 27% increase in graduation rate was largely the result of increased support from local colleges, community organizations, and individual tutors and mentors at digital initiative states. But now let me examine the economic implications first holistically, because they have never provided a single mechanism as to how the productivity is going to benefit the most vulnerable. We agree that economic activity will increase, but it will ultimately displace both low-skilled labor and middle-class labor, because now the technology is not replacing human muscle but human cognition, and therefore human labor will become and human intelligence will become redundant in the labor market. And even many of those workers are already qualified enough, but yet they will be displaced. Clearly, requalification programs will not work. What is the impact? While AI might increase some GDP numbers, it will ultimately harm the most vulnerable members of our society, and they will not be able to reap any of the rewards AI promises to bring to the economy, and therefore the economic implications are bad because of the unequal distribution of the gains of artificial intelligence. But second of all, concerning developing countries, we have shown how offshoring employment opportunities and economic activity from the developing world is harmful. Why is this impact more important than the affirmatives constructed? Healthcare systems around the world are broken due to the lack of resources and poor distribution of them. AI in healthcare is not a silver bullet, but rather a band-aid that hinders structural solutions. World Bank found that poorest and most vulnerable people are routinely forced to choose between healthcare and other necessities for their household, including food. WHO states that half the world population cannot access essential health services, and governments in developing countries won't be incentivized to deliver AI healthcare, as there are more important issues at play. Crucially, AI proliferates this because the reshoring will worsen the economic situation there and take them back to, and because of that, they will not be able to access any benefits whatsoever of healthcare. Moving on to the last area of clash concerning authoritarianism, because they claim it would happen otherwise, but it's 12 times more efficient with Uyghurs as we have provided. Moreover, with regards to international intervention, Human Rights Watch states that 10 democratic countries are supplying AI surveillance technologies into those democratically flawed regimes. But moreover, they also, like with regards to Hong Kong, note that by facial recognition, China has actually hunted those protesters. Why is this more important than their arguments? Concerning healthcare, authoritarians have no incentive to provide well-functioning healthcare to their citizens. To them, their citizens are mere means to an end, nothing more than just numbers. Our world and data finds that life expectancy is worse in those numbers, therefore they will not benefit from healthcare. A technology that benefits the most fortunate few at the expense of unfortunate many is disastrous for our society.
It's time. We'll now enter a period of cross-examination in which both teams will participate. We will ask again that the captains be vigilant about making sure that everyone on the team is asking a question and that everyone on the team answers a question. We will start with a question from the affirmative for the negative. And again, captains, if you'll monitor this, I'd appreciate it. Affirmative to negative. Questions, please.
Okay, I can take the first one. To the negative, you talk a lot about authoritarianism and how China is exporting, I guess, their surveillance technology to other countries. Could you point to a single country that was initially like genuinely democratic, but then suddenly pivoted to an oppressive authoritarianism after receiving this sort of technology? Just like name a country.
So the point here is that it's not entirely about them turning democratic regimes authoritarian. It's about them turning democratically flawed regimes authoritarian, or like regimes that are susceptible to authoritarianism. And this is actually true about so many countries in the world. As we have stated in our first speech, around 3 billion people live in democratically flawed regimes. And it doesn't have to be a fully democratic country in order for China to greatly influence it and to export this enormous tool of oppression, an enormous tool of surveillance to these countries, which are actually 18 countries that it exports the AI surveillance to.
And if I may add on to that, Bahrain was on its path to become a full democracy. However, in 2011, the regime used AI surveillance to crack down on the protesters. And ever since then, Bahrain has become everything but a democracy. It is a monarchy that basically retaliates against all dissent. Like, that is the case.
Question from the negative to the affirmative.
So AI has been present within the medical field for tens of years. However, no change has been made. While your second speaker said that AI will become better in those research in medical fields. So in how many decades do you expect the change to arrive?
I think this question is pretty leading, right? Because you're telling me that, oh, AI has been around for a long time, but obviously things like healthcare AI development are very relatively new industries. That's why we see a lot of like new leading articles coming out with research about AI. So specifically on our contention on, for example, drug development, very recently, i.e. like this year, we've seen a lot of AI supercomputers specifically do things like develop new strains of like bacteria and molecules that are able to effectively combat like resistance against superbacteria. So what's really key about this is that it's not necessarily about like, oh, AI has been around for a long time, why haven't we seen change? But rather AI is actually making a lot of development and is making a lot of development towards combating like, for example, antibacterial resistance and combating a lot of diseases that we haven't seen cures for before.
The key is that AI itself as a technology is also constantly evolving and improving. It's not like AI decades ago had the same capabilities that it does today. So we're always discovering new benefits as AI becomes more capable and smarter as well.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Is the increase in automation limited to specific industries and economies, or does it affect every single person on Earth?
If I may, yeah, we believe that even though it does not affect all the industries across the globe, its range of application is pretty much wide. As we have pointed out, as much as 47% of global workforce may be automated, especially in the US, according to Oxford University. So we believe that, yeah, it increases the scope because it automates as much, not just the muscles, but as well the brains. That is, it can also automate human-like activities that were previously inherent to humans. That is, Amazon's use in call centers, for example, previously couldn't be automated by robotics. And we can see the same trend, especially in, for example, warehousing by Amazon that has destroyed the entire retail industry in the US. So yeah, we believe it is not only limited to manufacturing, but middle industries as well.
Question from the negative to the affirmative.
So you claim that international actors will prevent the abuse of AI by authoritarian states. However, Human Rights Watch warns that AI spyware remains unregulated on the global level, and there are insufficient national controls or limits on their export. According to Felston's report on the global expansion of AI surveillance, countries based in liberal democracies like Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Israel, the UK, or the United States are actively selling AI surveillance equipment to unsavory regimes. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, UK arms manufacturer BAE has sold mass surveillance systems, while Japanese NEC is vending facial recognition cameras. As empirical evidence contradicts your assumption that democratic countries will prevent the expansion of authoritarian tendencies, why should we believe that the incentives and actions of democratic countries will suddenly change?
So is your question just like, so far we haven't seen a democratic institution explicitly combat AI surveillance, why are they going to do it now? Just clarifying. Like was that it was just that like, oh, we haven't seen democratic institutions do it now, so why are they going to do it in the future? I think that logic is like pretty flawed, right? Because once again, AI is still like a very developing industry, right? Like a lot of regulations are also developing alongside AI. But I think the important thing is we need to look more holistically at when in like previous years when new technology has come out and seen how we've regulated it. So for example, if we look at when nuclear weapons, when they came out, we were able to effectively regulate them. That's why we haven't seen like any sort of nuclear war occurring, right? Like, it's really unfair to sort of like take the beginnings of AI regulation and try and just assume that means this is the path that we will always take. It's more important to look at past tendencies, to look at the long-term analyze like the long-term timeline that we've seen in terms of technological revolution and realize that it's always been very successful. We've always been able to respond with to the same extent, strong enough policies to combat malicious actors.
I also think that you're making it seem as if we say democratic countries are totally democratic. They don't do any surveillance at all. We all know that's not true. Democratic governments also, surveil their own citizens. We say the difference is that, obviously, authoritarian countries like China abuse human rights blatantly, for example, with surveillance of the Uyghurs. So we would say that when democratic institutions step in, it's to prevent abuses like that. For example, we see the we see intergovernmental organizations and basically the international coalition already condemning China for its human rights abuses. That's what we're talking about. We're not saying democratic countries are going to completely scrap surveillance. We all know that's not true, and that's not what we're arguing.
Affirmative question for the negative.
Okay, I can take this one. So it seems as though your main argument against proper regulation is that the regulations we have in place right now are not binding, right? They're just like frameworks. If we can prove that this regulation moving forward is going to be binding and the regulation we have right now is going to be binding, do you think that this regulation could adequately address things like, income inequality and authoritarianism and the negative externalities that you talk about?
So first of all, on two areas here. First of all, authoritarianism. We know that the non-binding regulations that you are talking about, China usually did not sign into those regulations, so it doesn't have any even non-binding regulations to obey until, as well as most of the authoritarian countries didn't really sign into those regulations, and this is not applicable here. However, secondly, in terms of economy, what is very important here is that this is not a global question. This is to a big extent a national question, because it's, as we have pointed out in our speeches, it's about reskilling programs being ineffective. It's about industries. It is not like global organizations are able to push for regulations that will control entire companies and so on.
Negative question to the affirmative.
So in your first speech, you claim that AI will create jobs. AI will increase economic activity, and this will somehow, without providing a mechanism, trickle down to the poor. It will benefit, it will create equitable society. However, as research points out, entire populations and sectors could be automated. We can see it right now. AI is disrupting industries such as the Amazon or Google automation of call centers. AI is not creating new ones. Could you name at least 5 or 3 jobs that will be created directly by AI? Some that benefit the low skill and the middle income class, not just the rich and the poor, and rich and the high skilled. Thank you.
So the question here is like, name some jobs that are not necessarily high skilled. I think like if you look at a macroeconomic level, you need to realize that like when you create one job, you're going to have a multiplier effect. It obviously creates another job because, for example, when a tech company creates jobs, they're obviously going to have to employ people that are not necessarily all engineers. Like no company is able to function if they don't have people that help them out with like other things like reception or with like or their lower skilled jobs, right? So it's not necessarily that, but B, we'd argue that AI is much better at like complementing jobs that already exist. It's not like most companies are not going to just like let AI completely evolve on its own. They're definitely going to have people that are managing this AI, which is considerably like probably in certain cases going to be lower skilled than necessarily like being the people that build AI, right? And then we also argue that like in general, if wages are able to go up for everyone, even if there might be like an increase in income inequality, the overall quality of life is still on net better.
Thank you, everyone. That's very helpful. We will move directly to the question and answer period with our judge panel. I'll ask you to clearly direct your questions to one side or the other. I'll be keeping track of who's getting those questions and who's answering them. Again, captains, try to keep this answers as distributed among your team as possible. At a minimum, let's go down the line and make sure all three members of the team answer a question before somebody repeats, before somebody goes a second time. Will you do that for me? I don't want to interrupt the flow more than that. So with that, I'll step out and the judges will step in. So questions from the panel to our contestants.
Yeah, I'll start with a question for the affirmative. You mentioned in your constructive that regulation exists or will exist, and it seems like this is becoming a very important part of the debate, right? Whether or not this regulation has teeth or not. So first, a clarifying question. You mentioned that there was this new framework that 42 countries had signed up to. Can you clearly answer if China is or is not part of those original 42 signatories? And then I have a follow-up question.
Okay, I can take that one. Yeah, I do believe I'm relatively certain that China is part of this new framework of regulation. But even if they aren't, and I'm relatively sure they are, even if they aren't, they've developed their own regulation. They've developed their own frameworks, and they've signed on to other sort of international coalitions. And they've actually called for like regulations for things like, AWS. They've called for legally binding regulations against AI weapons. So clearly, it's not as if they don't have an incentive to regulate, legally binding or not.
Okay, so linked to that question, then, regulation is only as good as evidence of it working or not working, let's say. So can you guys point to maybe a specific thing that the regulation has already, let's say, changed or implemented that has actually avoided some of the harms that the negative is seeming to suggest? Is there, maybe if you can provide some more examples, that'd be helpful.
Yeah. Again, I would point to what Emily was saying about how AI is a relatively new industry. It's constantly evolving. So it's really hard to, say with 100% certainty, this regulation prevented, a nuclear war from happening, right? But I will say that it's not as if like we're not implementing regulations right now. So a Harvard Business Review article from just a few days ago said that the EU is raising taxes to 6% for companies that are implementing AI because they want to avoid some of these negative externalities like income inequality and automation that the negative points out.
I can go ahead, Miha. You're on mute.
Thank you. I also have the question for the affirmative for the beginning. Your strategy in responding to the constructive of the negative seemed to be you were trying to say that majority of their harms are simply not true, right? My question to you is, what if judges or audience buy into their harms, do you still think that you have a case? That is to say, do you think that your side can still win the debate on the comparative, even the judges take some of the harms presented by opposition negative?
Absolutely. So we think that first, our arguments about pandemics and climate change are a prerequisite to their arguments because, for example, pandemics give governments an opportunity to become more authoritarian by tightening regulations or implementing surveillance as a means of contact tracing, as several or many have already done. Climate change is also inherently destabilizing for a lot of reasons like resource scarcity, economic failure, overall lower quality of life, which leads to authoritarianism as well. So we also say that overall our arguments, because they concede themselves during our questioning period, that things like automation only affect certain industries and certain economies. It doesn't affect the entire world the way a pandemic does, or the way a pandemic-induced recession does, or like lack of healthcare that literally affects millions of people, and especially those in the poorest countries. So I think here we're first going to outweigh, like as a prerequisite, you always look to our arguments first, but moreover, we're also going to outweigh in terms of scope. We're just affecting so many more people than their arguments are, even if you buy into it 100%.
Since no one has asked the question of the negative, I think I'll start there.
Yeah.
You know, and I think this is just the opposite of Mia's question. The affirmative is offering some larger, if you want to say long-term types of impacts where, the key to us solving some of our healthcare, our future or even present healthcare crises is AI. Yeah, also with climate change and everything. Your impacts seem to be much more immediate. The fact that AI is going to immediately impact the ability of lower skilled and middle skilled workers to maintain their employment, and also create instances where autocracies can indeed harm their citizens. Why should I go for what I would call short-term impacts that might prevent these long-term impacts from happening? Why should I prefer your argumentation over theirs, knowing that in the long run, AI could indeed, solve some of these much larger issues?
Okay, so first of all, when it comes to authoritarianism, while we believe that the impact will happen immediately, we don't think it will go away soon, precisely because of the ability to absolutely control society. This will become almost impossible, which will make many of those authoritarian regimes close to irreversible. But second of all, in terms of the economy, we believe that this will proliferate the divide and on a global scale as well. And we believe that proper economic environment is a prerequisite to any benefits of theirs, because even taking the affirmative at their best, when AI could improve healthcare, if those regimes will be authoritarian and disregards the need of their citizens, and even if those countries would indicate reap some benefits, they won't be accessible to the underclass who will not have economic opportunities. And furthermore, they will not have really a political capital, because their voices will not be heard, because they will be marginalized.
And if I could follow up, when anything gains such a powerful tool as AI is, as we have seen in the example of Industrial Revolution with Europe, for example, when someone gains such a powerful tool of very huge change in the world, the results are permanent. The results are very long-standing, and they're very long-term. They're not just short-term, because it's such the tool of AI is so powerful.
Can I ask a clarifying question to the negative, please?
Sure.
Negative team, there's not a switch of AI on, AI off, right? There's varying levels of AI. Can you help me understand in your framework, please, whether or not any AI is acceptable? And if the answer to that question is yes, to what extent?
What extent?
So for example, we believe that some levels of AI is acceptable. For example, level of AI that is acceptable is, for example, right? When a car passes by on the road and it detects that the car increased the speed limit, right? These are the very minor parts of AI which do not give a competitive edge and like huge advantage to authoritarian regimes. These are types of AI that do not displace millions of workers. Like on minor levels, yes, AI is okay. However, when it comes to giving a huge advantage or huge change to industries, we believe it is not okay.
Thank you.
I have then back again question for the affirmative. It seems that there is quite an obvious clash and disagreement on how the development of the artificial intelligence is going to affect economy. And in your constructive, you were quite strong on how AI is developing jobs, not just low-skilled labor, replacing jobs, not just low-skilled labor, also high-skilled labor and so on. You even quoted some examples and statistics from Africa. The negative already asked you for the concrete examples of jobs, but I would rather ask you, can you explain us the logic, the structural reasons behind this? So how and why exactly development of the AI and further use of it is going to increase this amount of jobs? To put it differently, what is the reasoning behind the examples and statistics that you were quoting? Can you explain us why and how this will happen?
Yeah, so it happens in a lot of ways. First is through increasing efficiency and demand. When people are no longer working manual labor jobs, in the long run, people probably get higher education, move to the overall society shifts to more high skill labor. This also means that the overall economic output increases when people are more productive and more efficient. And when there's more economic stimulation, naturally there's more investment, more businesses spring up, and that's how you create more jobs. Secondly, is because when AI is a whole new industry, people can work in AI, right? So people who directly manage AI, that's like a form of employment, but also companies that spring up surrounding AI don't necessarily all employ high skill workers, because our opponents say that low skill workers are hurt by this. So if there's an AI company, yes, there are the high skill workers who run the AI, but there are also lower skill workers that need to work in communications, like management, other things like that don't require full knowledge of AI. It's still low skill labor. So as long as you're creating a new industry and many new applications in so many other industries, that's how employment opportunities spring up.
I do have a follow-up question. If the judges buy the negative interpretation, a negative stance on how the unemployment will happen, who are going to be the people, in your opinion, who are going to buy all the products produced through your investments, through your higher productivity, to your increased production? Because this seemed to be one of the logical steps that from a neutral position was now missing in this explanation. And this is the exact step I wanted to hear about.
So what I'm getting at right now is you don't see the link between increases in productivity to like low skill workers being pushed out. All right, so overall, the thing here, like what's really important to note is that the type of AI they talk about is automation. So this is actually non-topical. The types of jobs they're getting rid of it has nothing to do with AI. So on net, AI is still going to be the one creating jobs, right? But then second, we'd argue that not every single job can obviously be replaced by AI, right? For example, an artist, people are not going to buy work that is made by a robot, right? What's really key about this is that it essentially means that on net, wages are even if you buy that some low skill jobs might go away, there's always going to be other low skill jobs that aren't cut out by AI. And what's really important is when a company increases productivity because they're able to use AI tools, that makes it really in order for them to increase productivity further, they tend to increase wages, because when you increase wages, it incentivizes people to be more productive, right? And so that's where you see these people getting more economic growth. It's not necessarily through it's not that they are poor, but these companies are still producing more items, so these people can't get anything. It's that the people at the bottom still see increases in wages, which means that their standards of living are still comparatively higher than they were before.
Towards the negative, and jumping on here Miha's point about consumerism, you guys flagged that climate change is made worse by AI because of the consumerism kind of mentality. Can you help substantiate kind of this impact, the relative nature of this impact? I think the affirmative tried to do this in a previous speech. I just want to see if you guys you can use this opportunity to answer specifically that point again.
So to begin with an example, for instance, Amazon uses AI heavily in order to customize products and engineer search results on the page. And there is research showing that because of AI algorithms, consumers are 40% more likely to click and buy 50% more products. And to contextualize the scope of those impacts, according to research, 60% of all global emissions are caused by consumerism, and 99% of the products consumers purchase eventually go to waste within 6 months. And we believe that this is an issue which is comparatively more important precisely due to the fact that even at the affirmative's best, the scope of their impact would be limited because there is like huge political disincentive to combat climate change holistically, predominantly in authoritarian states, which are going to expand. And because of that, we ultimately think that climate change will be exacerbated on the affirmative side of the house.
Just to clarify, so consumerism is 60% of emissions, is what you guys are indicating. Is that like day to day, going to the market and feeding myself? Is that the nice to haves, like, you know, myself buying the latest Xbox, PS5, whatever you want to talk about? I mean, help me out here. Like, you know, what is define consumerism for me then?
Well, we believe that consumerism is the increased demand for goods. This is specifically increased and fueled by AI's ability to make people buy more stuff. It is the ability of corporations to make people buy more stuff. For example, to quantify this, it is as much as 40% higher tendency of people buying products from targeted ads, for example. Tailor-made advertising enables corporations to increase consumer spending and basically to fuel consumerism due to this.
Okay, so if I may add to this, like when it comes to consumerism, it largely involves like what is produced within companies, but also like it might be even what individual households use. And like we are not necessarily claiming that the causal relationship is such that AI is causing all of those emissions to increase like drastically. However, it's mostly like food we consume, clothes we buy, and according to Journal of Industrial Ecology, it indeed does comprise 60% of global emissions. So mostly food, clothes, or other products that are eventually going to be wasted.
I have a short follow-up on this. I see with Alexander we are today both on the consumerism topic. Can the negative just try to help me understand how can you at the same time claim that there will be a decrease in economic activity but an increase in consumerism?
We believe that we do not need individual consumers specifically to buy stuff. We believe that even though the theory we are explaining is that both sides can quite reasonably agree that the most money will be accrued by the big corporations. We do not need individual consumers basically to buy stuff. We need money and capital for it. So we believe that the most likely scenario is that the richest out of the most affluent individuals on this planet will fuel this. Those that will benefit from AI, those are the people that are able to use the technology for their benefit, but it is not the majority of the population.
If I could follow up on that, we see the contradiction between that income inequality rises, but at the same time people consume more. But we have to understand that income inequality does not necessarily mean that people will stop buying things. We have seen that in the world, middle class people and like working class people keep consuming a lot of goods, and they actually consume relatively the same amount of goods. Therefore, income inequality and consumerism, they do not exclude one another, they go hand in hand.
Question from the affirmative from my side. So the negative is saying that consumerism is really bad. Well, for consumerism to happen, the person needs to be alive, and your plan with healthcare extends lives. So crap. Now people are living, they're going to buy that extra shirt and cause even more greenhouse gas emissions that you're trying to offset. What happens now? Is healthcare good? Is that, I don't know. Help me out.
I think that for the negative to take that route would essentially be arguing death good. We think that logic is pretty flawed for a lot of reasons and probably not strategic. The reason is the terminal impact of climate change is like, increased weather disasters, instability, resource conflicts, things like that. So at the end of the day, it's still human suffering that you're trying to prevent. We would say that healthcare is one of the many ways that you prevent human suffering on an infinite time frame. And good healthcare also mitigates the effects of bad climate change because the effects of climate change, because when people have better healthcare, they're less susceptible to like any changes that happen in the environment or more viruses, etc. So we would say that healthcare is probably still a prerequisite to climate change in that sense. I don't think the negative, I would actually want to argue that death is good.
For the affirmative and everything, as far as climate change is concerned, is there an assumption that the products and goods and services that you are providing that the negative would then claim is some kind of like consumerism, whatever? If indeed we embrace the need for AI in addressing climate change, how would it also address the concepts of consumerism as well? In other words, how could it potentially mitigate the harms of consumerism?
Well, we think that my opponents link into consumerism. Well, firstly, the statistic they talk about how consumerism is responsible for 60% of emissions is about production of goods globally. That's not the same as buying goods and trashing them. That's where all the emissions come from. So already this argument's like not true. But secondly, the link into increased consumerism is smart advertising. But we would say that this probably applies to increased awareness about climate change and increased awareness about leading greener lives and not producing as much waste. So it goes both ways. Just because consumers are more incentivized to produce things, if they're being produced in cleaner ways, as our own argument about clean power says, and B, people are more aware about what's going on with the environment, then we would say that at worst for us, it cancels out. At best, we're actually improving the climate. We're actually decreasing the harms of consumerism by lowering the emissions that are released during production.
So I guess a follow-up question then to the negative, why are they just wrong? Why is this argument about climate change not a legitimate argument, based on some of the things that you want to argue?
So it's actually not true on two layers. First of all, we believe that the impact that they're providing about the climate or about AI helping climate change, as I have pointed out in my first speech, is largely insignificant because AI, while it helps with certain predictions and while it helps with certain measurements, like measuring that the water is dirty, right? It doesn't really address the issue and it doesn't enforce the policies that would solve climate change. We know that climate change is largely contingent on actually governments doing things on the global arena, acting upon this question and not on some magical tool that will come and solve this. And on the second layer, as we have already pointed out, consumerism is a huge part of that. The affirmative side cannot argue that they will have an economic upturn, that they're going to have an economic growth, yet people will not consume more things. It is simply a contradiction.
We have a little under 8 minutes remaining in the questioning period. Judges, are there additional questions? If not, we'll move on to final statements. But
I do have one question. Now we got a lot of details on harms and benefits on both sides. We even heard some comparative analysis and weighing. But I would now maybe go back to the beginning of this part, where one of the judges asked a question on the possible rules, restrictions, that seem to be one of the questions that will be important for the final decision. And my question to the negative is, why exactly, like what exactly is your strategy to convince the judges that we cannot get around the problems that you are listing as harms? Is this because these harms are inherent to AI? Is this because the restrictions and rules and all the things that we're discussing here not likely to happen? If so, can you please tell us exactly why? Like, what is the way in which you want to convince us into this? Is your strategy that risk is just too big? Can you please like make a clear final statement? How are you winning the point on why can't we get around this problem? Why can't we get rid of the harms and still take the benefits?
The issue is that AI is merely a tool. However, the trajectory of the tool is determined by the actors that choose to use it. And we believe that across the world, there are malevolent actors who are prone to abuse the AI. And while AI is not creating the problems, it is largely exacerbating them by exacerbating inequality and by intensifying oppression within authoritarian states. But the reason we believe that these harms outweigh the benefits provided by the affirmative is such that the success of their own argument is largely dependent on those two areas. First, with regards to authoritarianism, authoritarians disregard the needs of their citizens. Therefore, they do not really care about climate change, nor do they care about providing high quality healthcare to those citizens, which mitigates the scope of their impact. Notice that 2.6 billion people live in authoritarian states. And second of all, by exacerbating inequality, those who will become underprivileged will not be able to reap any of the possible rewards. And because of that, we believe that good economy and equality and democracy are prerequisites to the benefits of theirs.
Anything else? All good? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, judges, and thank you, teams. We've saved a little bit of time there. We will now have the final rebuttals from both teams. We will start with the negative for a period of 5 minutes. Final negative speech, 5 minutes, when you're ready. Make sure you're unmuted. I can't hear you right now.
Just to be sure, am I audible?
Yes.
Dear panel, there is no such thing as free lunch. The price that the team affirmative had to pay today was to lie. It was to lie to our very judges about, firstly, regulation. When Mr. Pauly asked, is AI regulated? Did China sign onto this ratifying document? They told you they did. In fact, they didn't. They lied about this, as according to OECD. However, what is more important is that even though this is not regulation at all, these are mere principles of AI use that have been ratified by people, some actors, however, they are not binding. So firstly, an utterly lie. Secondly, they told you on regulation, well, but EU taxes AI. Ladies and gentlemen, notice that this is completely preposterous, since AI cannot tax anything. There has no fiscal measures in place. So in a second instance, they lied to you about the possibility of actors to regulate AI. This is a flaw, and this is against this is not acting in the good faith of the debate. But furthermore, in my speech, I'll do the comparative of world absent AI and world present AI. So firstly, let's look at the benefits that AI could possibly bring, where we have explained to you that some harms exist and malevolent incentives are prevalent. So even though they give us the analysis of as to healthcare can benefit most people, we have shown you that they only benefit a minimum amount of people, because only 0.025% of people can access those drugs. They are unaffordable. But what is more important, AI fuels polarization of people. So they do not believe in vaccination, for example. There is the analysis they have never responded to, because it harms their entire case. They cannot prove that suddenly people will trust the scientific community once they are polarized to a great extent. However, there is our second point on authoritarianism, where we have shown you that for totalitarian regimes, people are just mere numbers. They don't care about their healthcare. That is why their life expectancy is way shorter. They never responded to this, which basically diminishes their benefits of healthcare in authoritarian regimes, ladies and gentlemen. These involve 3.9 billion people. This is a problem. But second, to climate change, where they have told us they can limit the amount of climate change, they can benefit everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, my second told you that they basically fuel the extraction of fossil fuels by AI. They add fuel to the fire of climate change, no response whatsoever as to why this is not a problem. When they told you about consumption, they told you that it's not only a problem of individuals, but then they consider this also fueled by corporations. Corporations that force individuals to use and buy products they lose on these grounds. But let's look at authoritarianism, where they consider like malevolent incentives exist. But ladies and gentlemen, China would be China either way. There is no problem with that. We believe it is not enough to tell us that suddenly malevolent incentives exist, because once you develop a technology such comparable to gas chambers that increases the scope and intensity of genocide in China, it increased the amount of people detained from 30 to 350,000. That is a problem. It is not enough to say bad people will remain bad people. This is a problem, a tangible problem we need to solve. Furthermore, to economy, where even Mr. Andrich has asked them about the mechanism as to why people would benefit from economic growth, because there was no specific mechanism. And notice the nature of their evasive answers. In the first cross, we asked them, what jobs will be made? Will AI deliver something other than productivity that does not necessarily have to benefit the normal guy, the layman? Well, they told us people will be able to manage AI. Normal people, truckers, drivers that will be displaced by artificial intelligence will suddenly become not programmers. Well, they will only work with complex algorithms that only academics know how to work. Well, we see there's a problem. However, what is more problematic is the nature of the job that will be replaced, because they told us that in Africa, the developed world will benefit. We will create an equitable society. But does this work this way? No, it doesn't. PwC and McKinsey show why the African continent and Southeast Asia will benefit the least, because there's no infrastructure from AI. Ladies and gentlemen, how can the African starting businesses benefit from AI if there's no infrastructure from it? How can AI generate jobs if there is nothing to build from? But what is more problematic is that 2/3 of the global working poor work in agriculture. AI poses a threat to this because it poses to automate as much as 3/4 of the jobs. If these people will be automated and their jobs will be removed directly by AI, don't get mistaken, because the affirmative tried to mischaracterize this. They'll be automated by artificial intelligence that is able to use not just their brains, but their brawns as well. They lose this debate. They lose this debate because they widen the inequality. They're unable to provide their benefits they talk about. They're unable to generate the regulations that would prevent the harms. But notice that the harms are tangible. They gave us the example of Hong Kong, but AI has fueled the suppression of those products. They lose in a tangible way, and they only give us a prospect of growth. That is a speculation.
We'll now have the closing speech from the affirmative team for 5 minutes, and you may begin.
Oh, sorry. All right. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Great. It's going to be addressing our arguments, comparing the arguments, and then addressing their arguments.
Go ahead.
Great. We are winning this round very, very cleanly on scope, on the severity of these issues, and on their long-term implications. Let's start off with pandemics. Pandemics are going to increase in frequency up to one pandemic every 5 years due to things like globalization and urbanization. And AI is the only tool that is able to mitigate or prevent these effects by being able to A, diagnose patients faster, B, increase hospital capability, and C, detect places where there are disease hotspots before they even occur. The only response that they give you to this is that, oh, AI is very polarizing, so people don't listen to the government. This is inherently just like not true. The people that get influenced in like social media to like be anti-vax are a much smaller group than the people that actually benefit from life-saving healthcare. People are not illogical. People like are not illogical. Just because they see a post about anti-vaccination doesn't mean they automatically believe it. On net, we're getting a lot of offense here. But then on climate change, specifically on renewable energy, climate change is killing 400,000 people each year. Green technology is the solution. We have all the resources to produce green energy from things like hydropower, from things like solar panels. We have electric grids that are very, very good in allocating energy. The only thing that we're missing right now is AI that is able to integrate this green energy into these electric grids. That's what we're advocating for right now. There's a lot of currently there's a lot of trouble integrating like green energy into electric grids because green energy is like pretty inconsistent. Like for example, like solar energy, sometimes there's no sun, right? But what's really good about AI is it's able to predict where the weather, what the weather is going to be like in a few days, and prioritize like what kind of energy they should be what kind of energy they should be using. For example, if there's no sun in a few days, they'll switch over to more hydropower, things like that. That's really good because our evidence indicates that holistically, AI can decrease emissions by 20%. Their only response to this is that A, a lot of big techs are going to like contribute to fossil fuels, and B, that there's a lot of consumerism. First on consumerism is such a small portion. Like the amount of consumerism that AI increases by is very, very small because it's targeting things like advertisements of like luxury goods. We'd argue that corporations and fossil fuel corporations are fossil fuel corporations actually contribute to the most number of emissions. So let's target that turn. In essence, our argument is that right now people might be shifting over to or the rebound effect of like making fossil fuels more effective is still on net much less than they switch over to green technology, because green technology is always going to be cheaper and it's always going to be more effective because it's like a renewable resource, right? And so that's why with AI, people still end up shifting over on net over to green technology. Our evidence indicates that on net, you say a 20% decrease in emissions, even if you buy that there's going to be fossil fuels. Let's do a little bit of comparative weighing here. First, our arguments are inherently long-term compared to theirs. Theirs are very, very short-term. You need to prioritize these long-term arguments over their short-term arguments, because even if, for example, you stop one person from losing their job in the short term, everyone is going to lose their jobs and die in the long term because of pandemics and climate change. But then second on severity, the recessions that are caused by things like climate change and pandemics are far worse and far longer than, for example, temporary job displacement from automation. Then on scope, our impacts are inherently global. Theirs are only going to impact certain countries or certain areas and industries, whereas pandemics and climate change affect everybody, including those at the bottom. They affect those at the bottom even more. But then we are a prerequisite to their arguments as well. Insofar as pandemics and climate change are inherently destabilizing, which means that they give countries an opportunity to turn authoritarian. Prefer these warrants over to, compared to theirs, because most of the countries that they are targeting are already authoritarian, whereas we provide actual external reasons as to why countries become authoritarian. Let's go on to their case. Let's start a little bit on regulation. First on regulation, we are winning this argument so cleanly. We're the only side that's providing any sort of warrant as to why there's going to be regulation. We explain that you need to look holistically at how governments have actually regulated industries. For example, if you look at nuclear weapons, we've seen that there hasn't been a nuclear war since they were being regulated, which is why countries actually are able to very, very effectively regulate new weapons. That's why we argue, for example, literally yesterday, the United States passed a tax on AI companies. They're already doing things like regulating and providing frameworks for a lot of different countries. This is really important because it means that we are on the trend to actually do regulation, even though the industry is very still developing. The implication behind this is very, very important because it means that we're able to tax companies to A, slow down automation, and B, we're also able to use international pressure to stop things like surveillance in the long term. Let's go on to their case. First on unemployment, remember, they dropped that the kind of automation they talk about is not actually AI, it's just like robots and assembly lines, which means that on net, they can't gain any offense off of this argument because it's not even topical. But B, AI actually increases efficiency with artificial intelligence because because there's like a multiplier effect. When you create jobs, you end up increasing productivity, which increases wages at the bottom. But then on surveillance, really quickly, they concede a lot of arguments here. Number one, they concede that AI is a tool that is only used for already authoritarian regimes. It's not used to turn regimes into authoritarian regimes. That's why you prefer our evidence on pandemics and climate change, turning these countries into authoritarian regimes. But then they also drop that China does not need AI to actually spread any sort of authoritarian things. Even without AI, they are already spreading like their authoritarian propaganda through things like the Belt and Road Initiative with a lot of opaque loans. On net, there is no uniqueness on their side.
Congratulations to both teams for competing so well in the semifinals of the International Public Policy Forum. At this time, we'll take a few minutes while our judges complete their written ballots.